Hey yo, what's good everyone? Twisted here with the Opener Sorcery, and today I want to go ahead and talk about cycles and circumambulation. Now, generally speaking, right, before we get to either of those, we're just going to talk about the base general idea of circles, right? And obviously, we understand that to be one of the basic shapes that, we always see in some way, shape, or form. But in terms of like from a metaphysical, spiritual, magical, esoteric sort of comprehension understanding, what does a circle actually symbolize? Well, to go ahead and kind of utilize the Matthew Peugeot book, The Language of Creation, I'm not necessarily going to quote anything from it, but just like go in lockstep with that sort of interpretation. Where in that book he's talking about the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. But in any case, right, the way that he kind of characterizes and frames it is that it is indicative of completeness, potentiality, possibility, and even time. And of course, like chaos, right? Because you can't necessarily have everything without chaos in of itself, and that's actually true nature of chaos. Something that later on may go ahead and touch upon myself or with Devi and or Lono about like order and chaos and that sort of nature, possibly. But yes, that is the general nature of the symbol of what a circle is, right? So going ahead and going even further, when it comes to cycles, right? When it goes to cycles, a symbol that we can go ahead and attribute to cycles is the Ouroboros. And that is in of itself indicative of continually going through a loop, a complete cycle in of itself, right? Coming to the same, starting point. The start in of itself being the same as the end. Another example of this that we see rather often is the major arcana of the tarot, where the Fool is the beginning, right, and number zero, right, and that in of itself, it being number zero as opposed to being just number one out of the 22 cards. So when the cards are actually numbered, it goes from 0 to 21, even though there's 22 cards in total. But in any case, the Fool being the number 0 card in of itself, and the number 0 correlating with the circle symbolism described before, that in of itself is showcasing that the Fool is encompassing that starting, that ending point, and the completeness of all things, including the chaos that comes along with it. That is the archetype, the nature of the Fool, right? That it encompasses everything. And if you want to go ahead and say the Fool in of itself has a role, that, whatever the current zeitgeist is, whatever the current status quo is, in order to represent the completeness of it, it operates in a paradoxical manner, opposite of it. So, in that regard, this is something that Matthew Peugeot's brother Jonathan Peugeot talks about quite a bit on his YouTube channel, utilizing Kanye West as kind of like a modern uh, person to utilize as an example um, of the Fool archetype and such. So, the other polarity, you know, being like, okay, if the modern world is like this is what Kanye West is doing in opposition to showcase this is what the true nature of the world is if you don't comprehend, you know. But not to delve too much deep into the Fool archetype. Like I said, you can go check out his videos, and who knows, maybe at some point I'll give my own 2 cents in regards to it. In any case, right? If we want to also look at a particular card of the tarot, we can go ahead and discuss the Chariot. That one in of itself talking about, a cycle, movement, and so on and so forth, right? Well, actually, no. The Wheel of Fortune. My apologies. The chariot is more so about travel and movement and such, whereas the Wheel of Fortune, that's actually more so about the cycle in of itself. And if you want to talk about completeness, then the world in the tarot is about the completeness in of itself. Which actually, from what I recall at the present moment, it does in fact show some sort of circle symbolism in it to showcase that. In terms of the Rider-Waite, the original Rider-Waite, uh, you know, visual, tongue tied, the visuals on the Rider-Waite card in of itself. Now, to move on ahead further, right? So, what exactly is it about, utilizing cycles within? Actually, before I get to that, before we get to like what we could utilize it for, let's actually talk about you know so we I touched on the Wheel of Fortune card, right? And cycles in of itself. Now, what exactly are some other examples of this in, say, Eastern sense? Well, look no further than the Wheel of Samsara, which in of itself denotes the reincarnation process that is said that we all go through as soul spirits, as entities who are in the process of maturation and growth, attaining and accumulating karma, whether it be positive or negative, and then having to go ahead and, for the things that we have unresolved, go ahead and deal with that. Go ahead and, work towards removing the bad karma, you could say, and continually, if you want to use a video game analogy of a character you're building up, continue to gain XP or experience, and eventually the point that you should strive to get to throughout these multiple lifetimes, even if you don't necessarily remember it or not, is to transcend this wheel of samsara and ascend, you could say, into becoming a bodhisattva, into becoming an ascended master, into, you know, becoming God in a sense, right? And there's, different definitions of how one would attain that. And, the left hand path definition being that you stay within the cycle in of itself, but you create your own little pocket, your own little corner, a little subdimension. But in terms of a, you know, transcending it, right? That's more so of a middle path sort of goal, whereas kind of like the right hand path is kind of like becoming subservient to it. So the analogy of like from left hand right hand, being a king in hell for the left hand as opposed to a servant in heaven. But the middle path, when you ascend using the Kabbalistic Tree of Life model, when you ascend the spheres of the Tree of Life in your own spiritual development and such, and the manners and planes of existence, you then can go ahead and reach the true domain of God and, potentially become a universe in of yourself. At least that's from my own theorizing and understanding of it. But yes, generally speaking, that is kind of like an Eastern interpretation of that. And so, how exactly can we go ahead and utilize, you know, cycles and circumambulation, you could say, in a practical manner and some sort of spiritual or magical sort of practice, right? Well, in terms of, it can be used in many sorts of ways, but I guess one of the more infamous manners to utilize as an example is the LIRP and LBRP, which are, of course, relatively speaking, the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram and the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. Now, I go ahead and state both of those in that order. Usually people call up the LBRP more so than the LIRP in terms of like what comes to mind first and foremost. But the LIRP in of itself operates on the idea that you're drawing energy into yourself, and the banishing, of course, is like you're putting it outward, right? So construction and deconstruction, right? And pretty much this ties into like the nature of the cycles and circumambulation in of itself. Like one thing that we have not necessarily touched on yet is you know let's actually go ahead and touch on it using a metaphor, an analogy. So let us look at a complete circle, right? Let's look at a clock, right? Because as I stated before, right, circle is associated with time using the Matthew Peugeot attribution. So with the clock, right, like the clock goes around in a clockwise sort of manner, so that's a left to right sort of direction. And that is like, things going in order, things going and progressing forward, you could say. And that is actually called, from my understanding, Deosil. And of course, the inversion of that, the backwards, a deconstructing sort of manner. And, you know, the the nature of that, you know, being like, all right, if you're constructing something with the one, the clockwise direction, you're doing the opposite with the counterclockwise, right? And that is actually called Widdershins, from my understanding. Both of these terms come from a recent video, well, recent at the time of this recording, from the Foolish Fish YouTube channel, where he went ahead and talked about, frequently asked questions and gave like a recap of some findings he had regarding his own, what he deems the heretic LBRP. If you are able to go ahead to his channel and check it out for yourself, you may find some interesting insights. A couple of which I have referenced prior and am likely to reference again. But yes, that in particular, I did not know that particular phrasing beforehand from Old English up until, seeing that video and such. Now, in terms of like how you can utilize that in your sort of practice, so if you're doing either the LARP or the LBRP, right? So the clockwise, going left to right in terms of your overall direction, and the counterclockwise, if you're constructing your own ritual, or say, whatever the case may be, keep those things in mind. Like, trying to think of another example to go ahead and like think about it with is oh, I got it. Righty tighty, lefty loosey. When you're kind of like using a hose faucet, right? So pretty much in order to get a tighter grip on things, in order to have more so order, you go ahead and you tighten the knob to the right, so that'd be left to right. And then if you're trying to let it loose, let the floodgates open, let, force and power and chaos through, and let it do what it does. Like, say, the water, if you're like, going to go ahead and use the hose, something like that, then you go in the left sort of direction, right? So pretty much keep those sorts of things in mind when you are going ahead and utilizing a magical practice, and you are either doing it physically, say you're walking around in a circle, and depending on the operation, you want to make sure that is the direction you're going for each intention. Or you could even say, like, if you're just like saying staying central in a location, you go ahead and you like face a certain direction, and then you move your body, like turning around in those sorts of directions. So for example, right, if you're looking towards the north at whatever given particular period of time, right, for whatever operation, then you go from north to east, and then from east to south for the clockwise, and obviously reverse. And for, if you're doing the opposite, for either invoking and or banishing, and just that general sort of framework. And also, even if you're doing it mentally, like even if it's not just a physical action, like if you're utilizing physical actions and visualizing within your, your mind, your mind's eye and such, keep these sort of things in mind for whenever you're going ahead and doing that. Um, yeah, just very generally, plainly speaking, I'm keeping it open, using the LARP and LBRP as examples, that I'm not delving into, how to operate those rights in of themselves at the present moment. But, there's so much literature, so many examples that you can go ahead and find out how to operate them yourselves if you're curious. And of course, for those, once you get like a little bit, once you are able to get a little bit more foundation for yourself, whether you do those practices or not, or just a foundation of spiritual, esoteric insight or other sorts of practices that you do, then, in the creative process, then I guess my repeating those sorts of things a couple times over, hopefully it drills into your brain and you include it as some sort of mechanism, if you see fit. The last thing I kind of want to say, not on the subject as a whole, but kind of like in terms of the clockwise, counterclockwise sort of thing, is that a pictorial example that you can kind of keep in mind for the directions of clockwise and counterclockwise is the swastika. Now, there is the Buddhist swastika, the original one, that isn't as popular nowadays because of the attribution of the Nazi swastika, and it getting demonized and like being like, oh, you know what, any sort of swastika is bad, and that sort of misinterpretation. But the Buddhist swastika actually is in a clockwise direction and has actually quite a bit of a positive connotation in terms of how Buddhists actually originally, meant it symbolically speaking. So it was talking about, the inherent nature of it is, the harmony with things, going along the path of the Dharma. For those who don't understand, that is the righteous path, the path of righteousness, and going along with, following the Dharma and such. And of course, if we're going ahead and have this understanding of clockwise being like, um, construction and building up, order, building up space, going ahead and going about the quote unquote right way to do things, then obviously the inversion of that would be how the Nazi swastika is represented, with it actually being counterclockwise, and thus the opposite of deconstruction, of going from order to chaos, from pretty much going ahead and using it in a non-righteous manner. So that's just a little pictorial sort of visualization symbology for you to utilize. Getting a little bit tongue-tied there, but in any case, a little bit of a picture for you to have within your mind when you think about these sorts of things, if you have not, connected these sorts of dots, beforehand. Now, to go ahead and speak a little bit more so about, like, what are some examples within, the whole of existence that we can go ahead and draw upon, as how does it, show itself within our, you know, material world that we can see. So a few more examples to help drill the concept in is, let's start with the orbits within our solar system. of the planetary orbits, from a heliocentric point of view around the sun. Now, you know, very plain and simple, these orbits go around in cycles, and they in of themselves go ahead and, you know, allow for there to be a variation of seasons, which in of itself is, their cycles in of themselves, and allow for varying conditions within the earth, on the earth, I should say, for different phases of life to occur, and thus regulate, not only for ourselves, but say for plants, say for animals, say for all the living beings to operate on, the underlying operating system that we all become accustomed to within this life, right? And, even from a sort of like, even if it isn't as like, we're kind of going from a macrocosm to a microcosm here. So, in that sort of sense, right, if it's grandiose as like a year long planetary cycle, and the year, as we understand on Earth, is different from that of other planets, but, just looking at it from our earthly, geocentric point of view, then, after the seasons, we kind of look at, like, say, the moon cycles, approximately 28 days in between each moon, just about a month or so. And, one way that we can look at it from a biological sort of manner of how it affects things is in women and their menstrual cycles. Whenever their periods do arise, more often than not, it tends to fall around, a month or so, 4 weeks or so, between each instance when their period first arises and such. Now, obviously, there's always going to be fluctuations and all that sort of thing, but, roughly speaking, on average, you know, that usually is how much time there is for that. And then taking it into even more so of a microcosm in terms of amount of time, unless you are someone like me who isn't always the most consistent when it comes to when I fall asleep and wake up and such. Usually, people say if you're working a 9 to 5, or say you have a set schedule, you have kids, whatever the case may be, or you're going to school, or what have you, that you develop a certain circadian rhythm, and with that circadian rhythm, it is your body, pretty much going ahead and developing, processes and phases, and regulating things according to what your sleep schedule is and such, whatever it may be, um, for better or for worse, depending on what your job is, what your lifestyle is, so on and so forth. People can contend, oh, you know what, you should be sleeping at this time and waking up at this time, in terms of being in harmony with, the sun being up and all that sort of thing. But the circadian rhythm is like an example of, you know, how we interpersonally within our physical bodies even have an internal clock that we operate under and such on a daily basis. Now, a couple other things I wanted to go ahead and state before closing this out is showcasing a couple other examples of like circumambulation itself. And one of those being, and I'm going to go ahead and look towards the Matthew Peugeot book, The Language of Creation, once again for an example, and I believe it's somewhere shortly after page 150, in the section about time and space, where he goes ahead and speaks about the story of the fall of Jericho and how, circumambulating around the walls of Jericho went ahead and it was symbolic And, if you believe the stories of the Bible as they were happening, right, in terms of this is the literary depiction of events that occurred, that the circling around the walls of Jericho and circumambulation of that process and the manner in which they did degraded the structure, the defensive structure of the walls, the orderly space, symbolically speaking, through the process of time, through the process of entropy, through the process of, you know, uh, deconstruction, to put it like that. And another example that you could say in the modern day that we can look at of circumambulation in terms of like utilizing it in a spiritual context and a person or a mass group of people, being able to have a sort of experience in of itself, right? Um, Now, I myself am not Muslim. I have not gone to Mecca, and I cannot attest from personal experience how it feels. But the circumambulating and circling around the Kaaba itself, the black cube of the Kaaba, which in of itself is eternity in nature and kind of goes along with the theme of time and order and all that, right? Um, well, that's a topic for another time of anything like that. But yes, the circumambulation around the Kaaba in of itself is another example. And what comes to mind also is going around and the dancing around the maypole, for May Day and such, is something that just popped in my mind. I actually didn't think of before popping on the recording button, but I guess it was meant to be put in here as an example. I guess the last thing I want to go ahead and touch upon before going ahead and closing this out is so to kind of like circle it back once again. This is kind of like me going in a cycle in of itself. Is circling it back to the symbolism of the Ouroboros, right? And being that I touched upon the book, the language of creation, which is a commentary on the book of Genesis, right? You know, who exactly is associated with the symbol of the Ouroboros and the cyclic process that began through the formation of existence, right? What came before that, biblically speaking, from the Jewish interpretation? That would be Leviathan, the sea serpent, um, coming from and is symbolic of the primordial waters. I would say that. Oh, yeah, and also the Ouroboros coincides with many other sea serpents and dragons, but that one in particular, Leviathan in particular, if you were to look for any entities to work upon breaking cycles, right? Breaking cycles and such that may be detrimental to you, to be harmful for you, then Leviathan is definitely a useful entity to call upon. Now, the thing about Leviathan, as well as the other one I'm going to mention, the other entity, is that they may do so in a manner that may not necessarily be the most comforting, but they are doing it for your good and because you requested it. And it's like, hey, look, this may not necessarily be what you want, but it's what you need in order to progress, in order to become a better version of yourself. To go ahead and get rid of the shackles of habit and comfortability, you know, that may be holding you back from becoming the most optimal version of yourself. Now, I've already gone ahead and mentioned Leviathan, and in terms of personal experience in helping breaking cycles, also you can look towards the Greek goddess Persephone, whose mythology and background story is indicative of operating on cycles in of itself. In that, you know, uh, started off with Persephone being daughter of Demeter, and eventually getting tricked into becoming the bride of Hades. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure if tricked is the proper word to utilize, but I say go ahead and check out the myth of Persephone for yourself to see if I was correct or not. A site I recommend for that is theoi.com, theoi.com, where there's a lot of good information about not only Persephone, but the entire Greco-Roman pantheon and such. But in any case, because Hades took Persephone on as a wife, and Demeter was not all too fond with that, they eventually reached an agreement where half the year Persephone spends the year with her mother, and that is more so during the spring and summertime, where things are more so brighter, things are more so vibrant, and energetic and such. And during the fall time, during autumn, and of course winter, Persephone goes ahead and spends time with Hades, and as governing as the queen of the underworld alongside her king, being Hades. Um, and yeah, um, when it came to me reiterating the myth of Persephone and such, not gonna lie, probably went ahead and maybe butchered a couple details or messed things up a little bit. Once again, I implore you to go ahead and read it for yourself. And yeah, in terms of my little instances of getting tongue tied or whatever throughout the video, if you went ahead and listened the entire time through, then I definitely appreciate it, and that you stuck through with it. And yeah, with all that said, I think I pretty much covered everything I wanted to on the subject. So, this is Twisted with Opener Sorcery, and stay frosty, Neguses. Peace.